In 1974, a director walked into a Hollywood studio with the most insane pitch anyone had ever heard. He wanted to make a sci-fi film so extreme, so boundary-destroying, that it would give audiences the experience of an LSD trip without actually taking the drug. The film was never made, but it changed cinema forever. And here's the thing, that's not even the wildest entry on this list. Over the next few minutes, you're going to see 10 sci-fi films that were fully planned, sometimes cast, sometimes built, and then killed before cameras ever rolled. And at number 1, a project so unbelievable, involving a director so famous and a franchise so massive, that when it was canceled, the reason wasn't money, studios, or lawsuits. It was something far more personal. These aren't rumors. These aren't concepts. These were real productions that got closer to existing than most people will ever know. Number 10. Halo, 2005. By 2005, Halo wasn't just a video game. It was a cultural institution. The franchise had already sold 13 million units and generated roughly $600 million in revenue. Microsoft had a golden goose, and they wanted it on the biggest screen in the world. What followed was one of the most ambitious, most expensive, and most catastrophically mismanaged film pitches Hollywood had ever seen. Halo was supposed to be one of the biggest sci-fi films ever produced, and for a brief moment, it almost was. But in 2005, Microsoft did something that had never been done before in Hollywood. They hand-delivered the screenplay to every major studio simultaneously. Within weeks, Universal and Fox signed on to co-finance. Peter Jackson attached himself as executive producer, and the director's chair went to a young South African filmmaker named Neil Blomkamp. The budget climbed past $150 million before a single frame was shot. Test footage was produced and leaked online, pulling in millions of views at a time when viral marketing barely existed. The tone was gritty, grounded, and militaristic. Nothing like the glossy, family-friendly sci-fi studios usually greenlit. On paper, this was supposed to be Black Hawk Down meets Deep Space, but behind the curtain, everything was falling apart. Microsoft demanded an unprecedented cut of the profits, something the studios had never agreed to with any partner. Fox and Universal pushed back hard. Negotiations stalled, then collapsed entirely. Both studios pulled their financing within months of each other, and just like that, one of the most anticipated sci-fi films in a generation was dead. Blomkamp and Jackson, left without a project, pivoted to an original concept that became District 9. In fact, Universal had spent $12 million in development alone before the project collapsed. Number 9. James Cameron's Spider-Man, 1992. Before Tobey Maguire, before Andrew Garfield, before Tom Holland, Spider-Man almost made his big screen debut in the early 1990s, and the version he had planned was nothing like what eventually reached theaters. James Cameron had just finished Terminator 2, which earned over $500 million worldwide and redefined what action cinema could do with visual effects. He was the most commercially powerful director on the planet, and his next obsession was Spider-Man. Carolco Pictures purchased the Spider-Man film rights for $5 million and immediately handed the project to Cameron. He wrote a 47-page script, part screenplay, part narrative outline, that reimagined the origin story with a much harder edge. The villains weren't Green Goblin or Doc Ock. They were Electro, reimagined as a corrupt billionaire named Carlton Strand, and Sandman, reimagined as a street-level criminal mutated through a freak atomic accident. Leonardo DiCaprio was Cameron's first choice for Peter Parker. Arnold Schwarzenegger was linked to a possible role as Dr. Octopus. The climax took place on top of the World Trade Center, and in one of the most talked-about details from the leaked script, Peter and Mary Jane had a sex scene on the Brooklyn Bridge while Peter described the mating rituals of spiders. This was not going to be a family film. Cameron envisioned something closer to an R-rated character study wrapped in a superhero origin. And here's the thing. When Stan Lee read the script, he loved it instantly. The project had real momentum, but Carolco was bleeding money. The studio that once dominated action cinema was drowning in debt, and by the mid-1990s, they filed for bankruptcy. That triggered a legal nightmare so tangled it involved Carolco, Marvel, MGM, Fox, Sony, and 21st Century Films, all fighting over who actually owned the rights to Spider-Man. Cameron couldn't wait. He moved on to Titanic, which became the highest-grossing film in history at the time. Years later, in his book Tech Noir, Cameron called Spider-Man the greatest movie I never made. And he might be right, because the version he had planned wasn't just a superhero movie. It was a James Cameron film that happened to star Spider-Man, but in an R-rated, Star Wars-related version. And Hollywood will never know what that could have been worth. Number 8. David Cronenberg's Total Recall, mid-1980s. Paul Verhoeven's Total Recall is one of the most iconic sci-fi action films ever made. But before any of that existed, a completely different filmmaker spent an entire year building a version that would have been unrecognizable by comparison. David Cronenberg was hired by legendary producer Dino De Laurentiis to write and direct Total Recall in the mid-1980s. The source material was Philip K. Dick's short story, a paranoid, cerebral piece about memory, identity, and the fragility of what we call reality. Cronenberg connected with it immediately. He wrote 12 drafts over the course of a year. His version of the lead character wasn't a muscle-bound action hero. It was William Hurt, cast as a psychologically fractured, deeply introverted man struggling to piece together memories that may not be real. Behind the scenes, Cronenberg introduced the concept of Martian mutants, which Verhoeven later kept in his version. His vision of Mars itself was drastically different too. Where Verhoeven's Mars was industrial, full of metal corridors and factory-like architecture, Cronenberg's was elegant and almost alien in its beauty. But then came the moment that killed everything. Producer Ron Shusett sat Cronenberg down and told him, "You know what you've done? You've done the Philip K. Dick version." Cronenberg replied, "Well, yeah." Shusett's response was blunt. He didn't want Philip K. Dick. He wanted Raiders of the Lost Ark Goes to Mars. Cronenberg walked away. 12 drafts, a full year of work, gone. Number 7. At the Mountains of Madness, 2003. Imagine this lineup. Guillermo del Toro directing, James Cameron producing, Tom Cruise starring, Industrial Light and Magic handling the visual effects, a $150 million budget backed by Universal Pictures. And the source material is one of the most terrifying stories ever written by the father of cosmic horror, H.P. Lovecraft. On paper, this should have been unstoppable. In reality, it never shot a single frame. Del Toro had been obsessed with Lovecraft's novella since childhood. The story follows a doomed Antarctic expedition that discovers the ruins of a civilization older than humanity itself, buried beneath miles of ice. It's a tale of forbidden knowledge, alien architecture, and the horrifying realization that humans are not the most important species in the universe. Del Toro didn't just want to adapt it, he wanted to make the definitive Lovecraft film, the one that finally captured the tone every other adaptation had failed to deliver. He first wrote the screenplay with longtime collaborator Matthew Robbins as early as 2003. They pitched it to Warner Brothers multiple times. Every time the studio turned it down. The reason was always the same. Del Toro refused to compromise on the rating. He wanted an R-rated, hard, no-love story, a bleak, unforgiving ending that stayed faithful to Lovecraft's original nihilism. On the other hand, Warner Brothers wanted something they could sell to teenagers on opening weekend. Those two visions were never going to meet. Then in July 2010, everything changed. Del Toro announced he would direct the film for Universal Pictures, with James Cameron personally signed on as producer. ILM began working on CGI test footage. The project was officially greenlit. For a brief, shining window, the greatest Lovecraft adaptation ever conceived was actually going to happen. Then Universal got cold feet. The budget was enormous. The R rating meant a smaller opening audience. And there was no franchise potential because the story didn't lend itself to sequels. To make matters worse, Del Toro later realized his script shared thematic similarities with Ridley Scott's Prometheus, which was already in production. He described the project as being on a long pause, if not demise. And that was the end. The film was never made. Number 6. Stanley Kubrick's AI, Artificial Intelligence, 1970s to 1999. Most people know AI, Artificial Intelligence, as the 2001 Steven Spielberg film starring Haley Joel Osment. What most people don't know is that Stanley Kubrick spent nearly 25 years trying to make that exact film, burning through 5 different writers, alienating almost everyone who worked on it, and ultimately dying before he could bring his vision to screen. Kubrick first acquired the rights to Brian Aldiss's short story Super Toys Last All Summer Long in the early 1970s. The story is deceptively simple. A robot boy is built to love, but the mother he's designed to bond with can never fully love him back. Kubrick saw it as a dark, cerebral Pinocchio story set in a post-climate change future. He called it a picaresque robot version of Pinocchio. But for decades, he couldn't crack the script. He hired Aldis first. They worked together for years before Kubrick fired him in 1989. Aldis later said, "Not only did the bastard fire me, he hired my enemy instead." That enemy was Ian Watson, who delivered a story treatment in just 3 weeks that became the closest thing to a working blueprint. Sarah Maitland worked on later drafts, developing a version where the mother was an alcoholic, and the film ended with the android boy preparing her a Bloody Mary. It was devastating, and Kubrick still wasn't satisfied. And here's the thing, part of the problem was the technology used. Kubrick believed that no child actor could convincingly play an android who never ages, and he felt CGI wasn't advanced enough to create the character digitally. So he waited, and waited. At one point, he even used a deceptive contract maneuver to free himself from the obligation to make AI so he could direct The Shining instead. The project sat on his shelf for years, always there, never ready. In the mid-1990s, Kubrick handed the directing reins to Spielberg, believing his sensibility was better suited to the emotional core of the story. But even then, Kubrick couldn't let go. He demanded that Spielberg install a fax machine in his bedroom so he could send notes, sketches, and ideas in the middle of the night. Spielberg later recalled Kubrick insisting the machine had to be somewhere private so nobody else could read what was being transmitted. Then, in March 1999, Kubrick died. The project finally lurched forward under Spielberg's direction, and the finished film was released in 2001 to divided reviews. It earned $235 million worldwide against a budget of roughly $100 million. Number 5. Alien 5, 2015. In January 2015, Neil Blomkamp posted something on Instagram that sent the entire sci-fi community into a frenzy. It was concept art. Beautifully detailed, atmospheric concept art showing an older Ellen Ripley standing alongside Corporal Hicks, both in full gear, both very much alive. For fans of the Alien franchise who had spent decades mourning the unceremonious deaths of Hicks and Newt in the opening minutes of Alien 3, this wasn't just exciting, it was redemption. Within weeks, 20th Century Fox officially confirmed that Blomkamp was developing a 5th Alien film. The plan was bold and deeply emotional. The movie would essentially ignore the events of Alien 3 and Alien Resurrection entirely, treating James Cameron's Aliens as the true last chapter and building a direct sequel from there. Ripley would return, older and battle-worn. Hicks, played again by Michael Biehn, would be back. And Newt, now grown into her 20s, would inherit the franchise as the next lead character. Sigourney Weaver was on board. She had previously said she would only return to the franchise for James Cameron or Ridley Scott, but Blomkamp's vision changed her mind. Concept artist Jeffrey Thorens produced dozens of images showing massive city-scale alien attacks in some kind of biomechanical suit fused with alien technology, and environments that married the claustrophobic horror of the original with the large-scale action of Aliens. Then the silence started. In late 2015, Blomkamp posted on social media that the project was kinda holding, pending Prometheus 2. Ridley Scott, the original Alien director, had shifted the studio's focus toward his own prequel series. Fox had to choose between the father of the franchise and the newcomer. They chose the father. Alien 5 was quietly shelved. Number 4. Alien Awakening, 2017. Scott had been planning this for years. Before Prometheus even hit theaters in 2012, he was already talking about sequels. By September 2015, he publicly stated he was planning 2 more films after Covenant that would connect to the original Alien. In November of that same year, he confirmed Covenant would be the first of 3 additional prequels, and the final chapter, a film known internally as Alien Awakening, was supposed to close the loop. The studio was behind him. The plan was locked, but it never happened. And here's what most people don't know. The screenplay for Alien Awakening was already finished. It was written during the production of Covenant and completed in 2017. John Logan was attached to write the follow-up. The story was set to take place on LV-426, the very moon where the original alien crew found the derelict spacecraft in 1979. Surviving engineers would pursue Michael Fassbender's android David following the horrific events of Covenant. It would have been the bridge that finally connected the prequels to the original film. Then Disney acquired 21st Century Fox, and everything changed. The new ownership brought a complete re-evaluation of every franchise under the Fox banner. Covenant's underwhelming performance made Alien Awakening an easy target. The project was quietly shelved. No announcement, no press release.
Number 3. Jodorowsky's Dune, 1974.
Before David Lynch, before Denis Villeneuve, before anyone in Hollywood had figured out how to bring Frank Herbert's novel to the screen, a Chilean-French director named Alejandro Jodorowsky attempted something that no one in the history of cinema had ever tried. He didn't just want to adapt Dune, he wanted to use it to create what he called the coming of a god, an artistic, cinematic god that would change the consciousness of an entire generation. And he meant every word of it. In December 1974, a French consortium purchased the film rights to Dune, and Jodorowsky was set to direct. He had just come off The Holy Mountain, a surreal masterpiece that caught the attention of John Lennon, who convinced the Beatles' manager to contribute $1 million to its production. Jodorowsky was respected in the counterculture. He was feared in the mainstream. And yet, he had zero interest in making anything conventional. Behind the scenes, the team he assembled reads like a fever dream. H.R. Geiger was brought on for creature and set design. Chris Foss designed the ships. Dan O'Bannon was hired for special effects. And the cast was unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. The production built over 3,000 storyboard drawings depicting the entire film in extraordinary detail. Artists and crew worked at De Laurentiis' studio outside Rome. By the time Herbert visited France to check on pre-production, $2 million of the $9.5 million budget had already been spent, and filming hadn't even started. The project needed at least $5 million more, and after 2.5 years of development, no studio would write the check. Jodorowsky was too wild, the runtime was too extreme, the vision was too uncontrollable. The project collapsed.
Number 2. Neuromancer, 1984.
In 1984, a struggling writer named William Gibson published his debut novel and accidentally changed the world. Neuromancer didn't just become a bestseller, it became the first novel in history to win the Hugo, Nebula, and Philip K. Dick Awards simultaneously. It coined the word cyberspace. It established the blueprint for an entire genre called cyberpunk, and its influence spread so far, so fast, that the Wachowskis openly cited it as foundational inspiration for The Matrix. But here's the thing. In the early 2000s, music video director Chris Cunningham worked closely with Gibson himself on an adaptation of the novel. Within a few years, that version collapsed. Then Joseph Kahn took over and fell away just as quickly. Vincenzo Natali, director of Cube, was given the project next and spent several years developing a script. That version died too. During the Natali period, things progressed far enough that Liam Neeson and Mark Wahlberg were offered roles before funding evaporated and the whole thing fell apart again. In 2017, Deadpool director Tim Miller was brought in by Fox, with Simon Kinberg producing, representing what seemed like genuine momentum for the project. Miller had just made Deadpool, a film that grossed $783 million worldwide and proved R-rated genre films could be commercial juggernauts. The stars seemed aligned, and then nothing happened. The thing is, the problem was never the talent, it was the shadow. The Matrix is so firmly entrenched in the public consciousness that films like Neuromancer would always be seen as derivative of the very franchise it actually inspired.
Number 1. Quentin Tarantino's Star Trek, 2017.
In late 2017, Quentin Tarantino walked into Paramount Pictures and pitched an R-rated Star Trek movie. Not a cameo, not a producer credit, a full Quentin Tarantino-directed Star Trek film. And surprisingly, Paramount said yes. The concept was wild. Tarantino's pitch was inspired by A Piece of the Action, a 1968 episode from Star Trek, the original series set on a planet that mirrors Depression-era American gangster culture. His version would lean into that premise hard, blending time travel, 1930s mob aesthetics, and the kind of sharp, profanity-laced dialogue that had defined his entire career. Tarantino confirmed this himself in 2019, stating plainly, "If I do it, it'll be R-rated. There's a script that exists for it now." A writer's room was assembled. Lindsay Anderson Beer was part of the team. She described the experience as the most fun room I've ever done. She recalled Tarantino patiently listening to everyone else's pitches, nodding politely, and then pulling out his own notebook and launching into 20 minutes of passionate, fully formed dialogue and ideas. Mark Smith, the screenwriter behind The Revenant and Twisters, was hired to write the screenplay based on Tarantino's story. Smith completed the script. It sat on Tarantino's desk. Everything was ready. Paramount was willing. J.J. Abrams was producing. The franchise was waiting. And then something deeply unexpected happened. Tarantino has maintained a personal rule throughout his entire career. He will direct exactly 10 films and then retire. No exceptions, no compromises. By the time Star Trek was ready to move forward, Tarantino had already directed 9. That meant Star Trek would be his last film, his final statement. The movie that would close out one of the most celebrated directing careers in modern cinema. And Tarantino couldn't accept that. In fact, in August 2024, he confirmed it with finality. It's never going to happen. Smith described the unproduced script as what would have been the greatest Star Trek film, not for my writing, but just for what Tarantino was going to do with it. The screenplay is still sitting on a desk somewhere, finished, complete, ready to be shot, and it never will be. What makes this the #1 entry isn't the scale of the production or the size of the budget. It's the reason it died. Every other film on this list was killed by studios, by money, by legal battles, by technology that didn't exist yet. This one was killed by an artist who couldn't reconcile a franchise film with his own legacy. The project didn't fail, the director chose to let it go, and somehow that makes it the most painful loss of all. If you made it this far, drop a comment telling me which canceled film you wish existed the most. And if you think there's one I missed, I want to hear about it. Until next time.